Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 12. In this lesson we're going to be talking about signal phase, phase relationships, beating, and the Haas Effect. So this isn't included in our Foundations of Sound series, but really it could be. It's just for my purposes and the way I'm covering these things, I'm not going to include in that. I know that our next video, which will be part of the Foundations of Sound series, is going to be particularly long, so I thought let's take a step back from that and talk about some things that are directly related to frequency and amplitude and that are incredibly important in the world of music production, and especially if you're going to be recording audio, okay? And especially if you're going to be recording acoustic instruments. So if you're recording a drum set or you're trying to record a guitar or something, phase can be a very, very important issue and something that not everybody fully understands. So let's just get right to it. I'm going to be using Ableton one more time, and the reason I'm using Ableton for my demos is because I have access to the Smexoscope plugin, which is going to be very helpful for you guys to see some of these examples, not only hear them, but if you're working in Bitwig, have no fear. There is a tool device which you can easily get to by just going to your devices, selecting audio effects, going down to tool, and it does exactly the same thing as the Ableton devices that I'm going to be using. So what is phase? Well, the University of Indiana says phase denotes a particular point in the cycle of a waveform measured as an angle in degrees. Okay, great. So just like we were able to determine a difference between frequency and pitch, there's a big difference between phase and phase relationships. So at any given moment in a signal, there is a particular phase and it's measured by degrees. So this example is going to be a sine wave, and you can see that it's plotting the degrees as it goes along the time variable, as it goes along the y-axis here. At 0, it's the start of our waveform. It's the start of the cycle. So we're at that 0 crossing point and nothing has really happened. At 90 degrees, we've gone up to our maximum point here on the y-axis. At 180 degrees, we're halfway through the cycle. At 270, we're going to be down at our lowest point on the y-axis, and then 360, which would be right here, is just going to be starting over again, and then we'll have 0, 90, 180, 270, 360, etc., etc. Is that particularly important? In and of itself, no, not really, but when we start adding and playing multiple signals at the same time, phase relationships are incredibly important. And I just want to give you one example right off the bat. If you watched in the last video, I linked to a video by NPR in which they show how sound actually looks. And this is great because it's going to tie in perfectly here. Now let's imagine you're multi-miking a drum kit, for example, and you have a snare drum, and now you want to record the top of the snare, and you also want to record the bottom of the snare. So as the snare is struck with the stick and you hit that membrane, sound is coming out and the pressure in the air is changing. It's compressing and it's rarefying those air molecules. And what the microphone is doing, basically inside the diaphragm of the microphone, there is a device that vibrates back and forth that picks up on the changes in the air pressure, those compressions and rarefactions, and then converts it to voltage, goes through a preamp, analog to digital conversion if you're recording digitally, etc., etc. Now, thinking about a snare drum, let's assume that each of your mics is 6 inches away. Okay, so you're 6 inches away from the top, you're 6 inches away from the bottom. However, when you strike that drum head, the sound that comes out from the top into the bottom is going to come at slightly different times. It's not going to hit right at the same time. So let's imagine point 1. And at point 1 with the top mic, we're getting this. Okay, we're getting the full power. We're getting that full compression. But at point 1 with your bottom microphone, instead of the signal being up here, it's down here. What does that mean? Well, think about it. +1 minus 1 is going to equal 0. So those signals at that exact moment, the phase relationship, we're going to have a canceling of frequencies and we're going to hear absolutely nothing. In the real world, it's never going to happen exactly like that. More often than not, you know, one point would be here and then the other point would be like, I don't know, here or here or here or here, it's still though going to cause some issues. We're not going to get as pure a sound as we would like. With electronic music, not that big of a deal, because in electronic music, there really are no rules. There's no one telling us exactly how our sounds are supposed to sound. We can do whatever we want and it's totally fine. But when recording an actual band or recording a drum kit or recording an acoustic guitar or electric guitar, bass guitar, we know what that's supposed to sound like. So if there's a huge gap or hole missing in the frequencies because of phase, we're going to know about it and we're going to want to do what we can to fix it. The best way to fix it is to re-mic your instrument to try to eliminate that phase problem. And if you are interested in that, do the research on your own, because there's tons and tons of great sources about ways to avoid these phase problems. And whenever you can fix the problem at the source, that's what you want to do. But in the case of a drum kit, there's always going to be phase problems. And so you're going to have to be flipping the phase multiple times. In the case of electronic music, phasing is an issue. And I'll explain to you when it's an issue as we go along. So let's just go ahead and take a look at a simple example here in Ableton Live. What I have right here is a sine wave playing the pitch of C3. I can solo it for us and we can take a listen. And we can look at this mexoscope. All right, and now with my other pitch, I am playing a C2. And I don't have a smexoscope on there, but let's bring one up because this is kind of important. Same settings, and just like I showed you guys in that frequency video, it's going to be playing at the same amplitude. It's just those wavelengths are going to be a little bit longer because it's a lower pitch. So let's play it. Perfect. But now what happens when we play these together? That is going to be our first example of a phase relationship. Is there a phase relationship between the left and the right channels here? Absolutely. But that relationship isn't really having any impact because our peaks are occurring at the same time, our valleys are occurring at the same time. And so that's meaning we have like a perfect mono signal and we're hearing everything right in our headphones, right down the center. And if you don't already, please put on a good pair of headphones that gives you a pretty good stereo response. So left channel, right channel. If you don't have that, there's going to be some issues and you may not be able to actually hear the effects that we're attempting to produce. But let's see what happens when we play these two signals together at the same time. Aha. So these are playing at the same amplitude, just different frequencies. And you can already see what's happening with this phase relationship. Instead of just having one simple sine wave, we suddenly made this a little bit more complicated. And now we've introduced an additional harmonic into the signal. And so that is what happens when we have the phase relationship between these two sine waves here. All right. And really, it all sounds completely normal. But if we wanted to, just for fun, we could flip the phase on one of them and see if we prefer the sound of it. Okay, interesting. And then we could take the other one and we could flip the phase on that one. In this particular case, there is no right or wrong answer. Typically, if you're working with acoustic instruments, you're going to want to go with the one that has a more defined low end, or just look for one that in your mind sounds fuller. If you can't tell the difference, then don't change it. You know, it's really not that big of a deal. But if you can hear a big difference, then definitely choose whichever one you prefer. So let's play this one and we're going to flip the phase. What this is doing here is this is referring to phase in the left channel. So if I just click this, it's only going to flip the phase on the left channel. And by flip the phase, all I mean is that where you see a peak, you're going to have a valley there. So I'll just show you what it looks like quickly so you can see before I go any further. So watch this top channel and watch the top right here and see what happens. Okay, so it's basically just flipped. All right, easy enough. I'm going to flip that back though. And let's listen to what we can get. That sounds pretty cool. We could watch our smexoscope, see if it's really changed. has changed a little bit. It's changed sort of the amplitude and the sharpness of those curves and those peaks. Maybe it didn't change it, I don't know. But my point is, in the realm of electronic music and when working completely inside the box and working with all these plugins and everything else, it is important to check your phases at various stages, but always just go with whatever sounds right to you because there are no rules per se. But let me just show you the example of what happens if we have a perfect phase cancellation. Again, this can never really happen in the real world, but we're lucky enough when we're working with audio here that I can show you exactly what it looks like and exactly what happens. So I'm just going to take this track, option click it down to duplicate it. And right now, if we play it, all we're going to have is a perceived doubling in loudness. And actually, it may not even sound like a doubling. We've already talked about the logarithmic scale and perceived loudness and all that stuff, but let's just take a listen when we add this in. Uh-oh, we flipped. Here we go. All right, so we just get a louder signal, basically. And I can show it to you on this mexoscope as well. So it just basically doubles. But what would happen if I turn this one out of phase? And if you were watching closely, you're already going to know what happens. But to make this point a lot clearer, let's freeze and flatten this track. So now where we had peaks, we have valleys and vice versa. So just like I was saying, these are both registering at a +1 as an example, and these spots are both registering at a -1, so they're going to cancel out. And all the way along this waveform, that's what's going to happen. We're going to have the frequencies canceling out. And this is phasing at its most extreme. Nothing. Okay? But the interesting thing is, if I start to split these signals and I pull one to the left and one to the right, we will get the sound back. And that's why when you're working in mono, for example, you need to make sure that your phase is on point, as in you're not having too many serious phase issues because it will really register. But when we're in stereo, not as much a problem. In fact, not a problem at all, because both speakers or both sides of your headphones are working independently. It's still playing this back, but in the right speaker, for example, which is this one, we're starting, let's see, what are we starting with on the right? On the right, we're starting by going up. On the left, we're starting going down. So on the right, we're compressing. On the left, we are rarefying. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. That should make pretty good sense. But as I pull them back, we're going to start to get that phase issue yet again. And we're going to start lowering the signal until we are back at basically nothing. Okay, perfect. So that is phasing at the most extreme, but like I said before, this can happen all over the place. And as you get more and more tracks in your mix, you could have phasing issues between track 1 and track 20, track 20 and track 35. And even as you start doing effects, like if you're using EQ or delay effects, you could also start to have phase issues, not only with the track itself, but in its relationship with other tracks. So I would encourage you guys to, if you're working in Bitwig or Ableton, always have a utility at the end of the chain and just sometimes throw the phase out. You can use it as a fun effect from time to time. And I would encourage you to do that. So for example, sometimes if you had a sound, this isn't going to be the best example because this is already a very wide sound. And if we zoom in closely on here, you're going to see what they've done with these two channels. If we zoom in really close. Let's maybe go a little deeper into the sounds. Let's see if I can show you guys. So what you're going to see is that these don't line up exactly. So right here, I'm at a spot, right? I'm kind of at like a peak at a thing. And here I'm midway through it. And this is true throughout the signal, which means that they've already done a little bit of slight delay between the two channels. They're already causing some phase differences to try to get this sound to sound wide, which it will when we click play. So if I actually... I'm going to unmap these. If I actually just switch the phase in one of these guys, it's probably going to cancel out most of the signal. Let's see what happens. That boosted it. That's interesting. It didn't have the effect I thought it would have. Maybe it would if I were to flip the phase and then do it. But anyway, that's my point, that you can sometimes get some really interesting results by just flipping either the left or the right in any given signal, or you can flip them both and see what you prefer then. And you can also play around with just the width. So if you just want to hear what's on the far left and far right, or what's just shooting down the middle, you can do it. So pretty cool right there. It's one thing I sometimes do when I finish a sound and I'm just thinking, what's something I can maybe do to make this a little more interesting or put a little more emphasis on one channel versus the other. You can just flip the phase on either the left or the right channel, and it's easy to do that in Ableton and in Bitwig. Okay, so let's go on to our next effect here, and we're going to talk about beating. And why don't we read just a basic Wikipedia definition of beating. This is referring to binaural beating, which is going to have to do with having your channels split left and right and then causing this effect, but you can do it without actually taking those channels out to the left and right. And that's what we're going to do. But binaural beats or binaural tones are auditory processing artifacts or apparent sounds caused by specific physical stimuli. This effect was discovered in 1839 by Heinrich Wilhelm Dove and earned greater public awareness in the late 20th century based on claims coming from the alternative medicine community that binaural beats could help induce relaxation, meditation, creativity, and other desirable mental states. Unfortunately, I don't think that was ever proven, but maybe it does, I don't know. The effect on the brain waves, and this is the important part, depends on the difference in frequencies of each tone. For example, if 300 Hertz was played in one ear and 310 in the other, then the binaural beat would have a frequency of 10 Hertz. And what this is going to result in is low frequency pulsations, or in our case, it's basically just going to result in amplitude variations. So if you did split left and right, you might get more of a low frequency pulsation, but for us, it's going to just work with amplitude, and we'll do both. We'll play around as much as we can here. And I'm just going to show you guys kind of an unrealistic example, and then we'll do how it's actually used in the real world. Okay, so I've got this little guy up here, and this is what we got just right now. Maybe we could also put on a smexoscope if we want to get super fancy. All right, here's our tone. Not all that exciting. We already know what's going to happen if we just double this. Don't worry about what I'm doing in here. We're just going to get double the amplitude. But now watch and see what happens as I slowly begin to change the frequency. By altering this fine tuning, I'm going to be changing the frequency and thus altering the phase relationship between sine wave 1 and sine wave 2. So let's do it. This is beating that's occurring. I can speed it up, slow it down. If we start to go too fast, we're going to actually start to introduce sidebands. And so we're going to start to actually hear just one pitch. This is kind of like very demodulation. We could really go crazy. But that all began with just this. And let's see what it looks like in this mexoscope. Oh yeah, that's crazy. Let's get crazier. Oh yeah, look at that. We hit a hot spot there, didn't we? And if we zoom out, you're gonna see what this actually looks like a little bit better. Oops, sorry. We can look at this in just traditional beating standards too. So you can see how the amplitude is really changing. All right, why don't we do what Wikipedia told us to do, and let's duplicate this. Let's throw one all the way on the left, throw the other all the way on the right. Record both of them. Let's see if I can think about how to do this properly. Okay, so I'm going to turn off B on this one. Turn off A, so we have B and A. So we should now have just a loud. Cool. And now I'm just going to slightly change the fine tuning. Let's see what happens. Oh, wow. That is awesome. Take it down octave. Lower octave is going to mean we have to actually bring the fine tuning up knob higher to get the same effect. Interesting. So that's actually kind of having that like phase effect where now we're putting more emphasis into the left channel. And I wonder if we go to the other one, puts the emphasis into the right channel. Very, very cool. Very cool. So you can see here, all we're doing is changing frequency. We'd have to look at one on the master channel with this up a ways to see what's going on. Maybe I'm going too fast. I don't know, but anyway, very cool effect beating is, and you can mess around with that on your own time if you guys want to do that. You don't just have to use a synthesizer to do that. So I guess I'll show you guys how to do this. Some of you might be really bored when I go through and do these examples, but whatever, this is cool. We can do that. We can do this with audio if we want to. And I think I already did this when I was going through this on my own. Uh-oh, hopefully I didn't delete something I needed. Okay, so let's make two audio tracks. Call this one a ridge. Call the other one beat. And I'm going to first of all just resample. What note are we playing? C3, that's perfect. And let's just go ahead and resample this real quick. You guys never knew you could have so much fun with sine waves. Till today. And now what I could do is I could adjust the fine tuning ever so slightly. Let's just put it at, I don't know, 40. And we'll record this out for another 4 bars. That is not the most pleasant tone in the world. Cool. And now let's bring them into our arrangement view here. And we're going to look at them. Original and beat. And now we can play these guys back. Hopefully they'll play for me. This is really cool. I just love this. But we can zoom in on these and we can see that our frequencies are not going to be lining up exactly. So here's our peak on this beating track, which is going to be going a little bit quicker, right? The frequency, I fine-tuned it up, so it's going faster than this original, which is going to be going just a little bit slower. And so by doing that, we're going to have some various phase cancellations happening throughout the entirety of the waveforms, and thus the beating is what results. Now, how is beating used in the real world today? Very simple. Basically, for instruments in orchestra to tune, what they'll do normally, and we'll just use violin as an example. We have a first violin, and they're going to play a note. So this is what they would do. They would play a sustained note. And now when the other violins have to come in, let's assume this one is out of tune. Oh, that's a lot. Let's hear what happens when we bring in our other violin. This isn't a particularly good example because no two violins are going to sound exactly the same to begin with, and they're also not going to be panned dead down the center. But just so I can show you guys how, let's say, a violin that's way out of tune is going to get into tune, they're going to hear that beating, and then they're going to make slight adjustments to get themselves close to what that first violin sounds like. So here it is. And they're going to try to get as close as they possibly can. Now, since we're in the computer, it's very easy for us to make it perfect. But in the real world, it's never going to be perfect. And let's say you have a section of like 10 violins. The fact that they're all just a little bit out of tune is what's going to make them sound so wide and so big. I'm sure many of you have been to a very nice concert hall and have sat down and listened to a live performance by a decent orchestra. I've always been really overwhelmed and blown away by the power that an orchestra can have, despite the fact that each of those instruments on their own isn't particularly powerful. So when they do try to tune, remember that no two violins are the same, and this is the real world, so we can't get things perfect. Only in the computer can we get things calculator perfect. And calculator perfect doesn't necessarily sound better. And prime case in point here, a string ensemble. And so what we would have to do here is we'd have to make like 20 of these guys and adjust their fine tuning ever so slightly and adjust the panning on them ever so slightly, all of them a little bit different. And you'd actually be able to produce a similar effect to an orchestra. And you could get a really wide and huge and just absolutely incredible sound if you wanted to do that. Okay, so for our last example, we're going to talk about the Haas effect. And the Haas effect is also known as the precedence effect, and I'll very quickly go up and read to you guys what Wikipedia has to say about it, which is normally pretty good. The precedence effect, or law of the first wavefront, sounds like some kind of World War II wavefront, I don't know, is a binaural psychoacoustic effect when a sound is followed by another sound separated by a sufficiently short time delay below the listener's echo threshold. Listeners perceive a single fused auditory image, that's very important. Its perceived spatial location is dominated by the location of the first arriving sound, the first wavefront. The lagging sound also affects the perceived location, however, its effect is suppressed by the first arriving sound. Okay, so that's what we have in a very, kind of technical, science-y type terminology. What does it mean for us? Well, very simple. Let's say you have a mono sound source. So I've taken this piano, which isn't really mono, but for the sake of this, we've mic'd it to mono. Probably a better example would be to do this on your own voice, and or just take a sound, put it into mono. That's what I've done with this piano. So here's our piano. And here's our piano in mono. And now what the Haas effect is taking the two channels on our piano. So why don't we just... Let's make that a little longer. Okay, so we're going to get our mono signal here. It's good enough for me. And we can go and look at it quickly. And so our two signals here, our two sides, our left and our right side, is exactly identical. Okay, so we're not really having any phasing issues or anything like that. We just have one sound and it's coming straight down the middle. So what the Haas effect wants us to do is to take one of these sides and slightly change its time. And by changing its time, what we're actually doing is we're creating a delay effect, and a lot of effects that we'll be covering are delay-based effects. But this is directly related to phase, as all of delay-based effects are related to phase, because by slightly putting one of these out of time, we're going to be impacting the relationship between the left and right channel. So I can actually do this just with audio if I duplicate this. And let's pan one to the hard left, one to the hard right, so it should still sound like it's coming out the center. But now let's see what happens if I delay one of these just slightly. So we're still getting basically a mono type looking signal. However, for localizing this sound, it sounds a little bit stronger in the right ear, at least to me. And we could change this and we could bump this up a little bit. Actually, that one sounds stronger in the right ear, doesn't it? Yeah, I had my left and my right confused. This one definitely sounded a little bit stronger in the left ear, and that's obviously because we're on the right and we're pushing that off, so we're hearing the left sound first, followed by that right sound. But because the delay time is so quick, it's still sounding like one sound. But we can do the same thing using a simple delay device that can split your left and your right channels, and you could do this in Bitwig as well, very simply, and we will be doing it in Bitwig, so don't worry. You can figure it out yourself, though. I'm going to change it from sync to time and put my dry wet up to 100. If I up my feedback, for example, and then I really put this up to like 300 milliseconds, this is obviously a very perceivable delay. We can hear the echo on the sound. which actually sounds pretty cool, at least to me. Maybe we can do something with that later. But for our purposes, put the feedback down to 0 so you don't have that trailing delay. And then just slightly offset one of the channels, and we're going to get the same effect. Dead center. A little bit of space. And of course we could do it with the other channel as well. And this you have to really set to taste. So I would, in Ableton Live, I think in Bitwig you hold Shift to kind of micro make changes. In Ableton you have to hold Command. So you just have to kind of find a spot that really works for you. And if we added a reverb here, it would make things. Is there like a wide reverb on here? Let's try spacious. Pretty cool, pretty cool. And if I was to take off the simple delay, the reverb is actually adding a little bit of width for us. But if I turn this back on, get a little more width there. So that's an effect that people use all the time. However, a lot of people are very scared about using this effect because if after the fact you've had this mono input source or even any source and you've used the Haas effect on it and then you have to sum it back down to mono, you're going to lose a lot and it's going to cause some bigger phasing issues to occur when this is then summed back to mono because instead of having those separate channels, they become morphed back into one. And so if I'm clicking now, see if I bump this up. But if I turn off the simple delay, still sounds pretty good. So that's one thing to be cautious of, and it's a reason why if you do plan to have a mix that needs to sound good in mono, you need to be sure that you're checking these sorts of phase relationships and your Haas effects constantly. Of course, there is a way for us to still get the benefits of the Haas effect and still get it to sound good in mono, which we'll be going over at a later time, but basically it consists of taking this effect here and grouping the effect, adding a chain that's completely dry. And remember, we still have our sum to mono. Well, let's turn that off for a second. And now let's start bringing in this wetter chain, the one that has the effect on it. This one has the Haas effect on it. This one has no effects. Wait a minute. What happened to my Haas effect? There you are. And now let's start to bring this in. And now if I go back to mono, not quite as bad. Still, there are some issues there, but not as noticeable as when you don't have this working in a parallel configuration. All right, so I hope that that was helpful for you guys. Our next video is going to be back to our Foundations of Sound series, and we're going to be getting pretty in-depth, so I'm sure it's going to be quite a long one. I hope you enjoyed this one. Please go out and experiment with some of these concepts. And like always, you can let me know what you come up with. I'm always happy to hear it. And thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you again in the next lesson.